For 79 BC marks the precise moment in the timeline of the Achaemenid Empire when a celebration of power transformed into a tragedy that history has largely chosen to forget. Picture the scene within the monumental halls of Susa, where the air is thick with the smoke of expensive incense and the murmur of the ancient world's most powerful elite. You are standing in the center of a banquet hall that holds the fate of nations. Yet the only thing that matters in this suffocating second is the terrified silence of a 14-year-old girl who has just realized her life is over. The music, usually a constant stream of harp and flute designed to soothe the royal court, has cut out abruptly, leaving a void filled only by the heavy breathing of drunken nobles. Your father, Xerxes the Great, the King of Kings, the man believed by millions to be a god walking among mortals, has just traded your future for a moment of arrogant pride. Across the polished floor, an elderly man named Artabanus, a general with skin weathered by decades of war and eyes gleaming with a predatory victory, bows low. He has trapped the emperor in a verbal snare, and he knows he has won. The young princess, whose name is Amestris, stands frozen, her silk robe suddenly feeling like a shroud. She looks to her father, begging silently for him to laugh, to dismiss the request, to act like the protector he is supposed to be. But Xerxes does not look at her. He stares straight ahead, his eyes glazed with wine and panic, realizing that his absolute authority has become his own prison. He cannot refuse. To refuse would be to admit he is a liar in front of the very subjects he rules through fear and awe. And so, with a single, slurred word of agreement, he sentences his daughter to a fate worse than death. This is not just a story of a bad marriage. It is a forensic examination of how the absolute power of the Persian Empire devoured its own children, a case study in psychological destruction that remains one of the darkest chapters of ancient history. If you are drawn to the hidden horrors of the past and the untold stories of royal women, stay with me, because we are about to unravel a narrative of betrayal that goes far deeper than a single banquet. To truly grasp the horror of what happened to the younger Amestris, you must first immerse yourself in the terrifying reality of the world she inhabited. The Persian Empire under Xerxes was not merely a kingdom. It was a sprawling superpower that engulfed the known world. It was a civilization built on the backs of nearly 50 million subjects, all of whom lived and died by the word of one man. In the Achaemenid court, the king's word was not just legislation. It was a cosmic law, irrevocable and unchangeable, a concept known as the laws of the Medes and Persians. But for the women trapped inside the gilded cage of the royal harem, this power was a double-edged sword. The harem was a fortress within a fortress, a secluded world of eunuchs, concubines, and princesses where privacy was a myth and survival was a daily political maneuver. Amestris was born into this high-stakes environment, the daughter of Xerxes and a secondary concubine. Yet she possessed a lineage and a beauty that made her a valuable asset in the royal inventory. Unlike the nameless daughters often shipped off to satraps in distant provinces to secure alliances, Amestris had been kept close to the throne, a favor of her father, educated in the refined arts of the court. She shared her name with the king's fearsome primary wife, Queen Amestris, a woman known for her brutality. But the younger Amestris was described as having a gentler spirit, one that had not yet been hardened by the lethal intrigues of Susa. She was a jewel of the empire. Yet in the eyes of the state, she was ultimately nothing more than currency. The tragedy began in the aftermath of the Greco-Persian Wars, a time when Xerxes, stinging from his defeats in Greece, sought comfort in the excesses of his court. It was during this period of vulnerability and hedonism that the fatal banquet took place. The king, surrounded by sycophants and flowing wine, made a classic blunder hubris. He swore a sacred oath to the Persian gods that he would grant any boon asked of him by his guests. It was a theatrical display of generosity meant to reassert his dominance, but Artabanus, the cunning old general, saw the opening. Artabanus was a relic of the previous reign, a man who felt his influence waning. He sought a way to bind himself permanently to the royal bloodline. He did not ask for gold or lands or armies. He asked for the king's daughter. The request was a masterstroke of political manipulation. By asking for Amestris, Artabanus was challenging the king's honor. If Xerxes refused, he broke a divine oath and showed weakness. If he agreed, he sacrificed his own child. The silence that followed the request was the sound of a father weighing his reputation against his daughter's life. And in the cold calculus of autocracy, the reputation won. The marriage that followed was a grotesque parody of celebration. Amestris, barely a teenager, was wed to a man in his 60s, a man who viewed her not as a wife, but as a trophy of his intellect and a vessel for his ambition. The wedding ceremony, draped in the opulent luxury of the Persian court, was a spectacle of despair for the bride. She was moved from the royal women's quarters to the residence of Artabanus, a transition that marked the end of her freedom. The reality of her new life was immediate and suffocating. Artabanus, paranoid and possessive, understood that his new wife was a direct link to the throne, and he intended to hoard that connection. He cut her off from her family, forbidding contact with her sisters and her mother, effectively placing her in solitary confinement within his own household. For a young woman raised in the communal, albeit restrictive, atmosphere of the harem, this isolation was profound psychological torture. She was surrounded by guards and servants whose loyalty belonged solely to her husband. Historical fragments suggest she attempted to send letters to her father, pleading for him to intervene, to find some loophole in the traditions that would allow her to return home. But Xerxes remained silent. His silence was not born of ignorance, but of shame and political necessity. He had made a public choice, and to walk it back would be to invite instability. So, he let his daughter suffer to keep his throne steady. The abuse Amestris endured was not just emotional. It was physical and reproductive. Artabanus was obsessed with producing an heir who would carry the blood of Xerxes, cementing his own legacy. He subjected the young girl to relentless pressure, treating her body as a biological machine. The court physicians were brought in not to care for her health, but to ensure her fertility, administering treatments and potions to a child bride who was withering away from grief. 3 years into this nightmare, in 476 BC, the inevitable happened. Amestris fell pregnant. For Artabanus, this was the ultimate victory, the fruition of his long game. He celebrated with lavish sacrifices, parading his triumph before the court. But for Amestris, the pregnancy was a final lock on her cage. In the ancient world, a royal mother could never be discarded, but she also could never leave. She was now permanently tethered to her tormentor. Witnesses from the time, whose accounts were later filtered through Greek historians like Herodotus and Ctesias, described the transformation in the princess. The vibrant girl who had loved music and poetry vanished, replaced by a ghostly figure who spent her days staring blankly at the walls of her prison. She stopped eating. She stopped speaking, and she moved to the palace like a sleepwalker. When a child, a boy named Xerxes after his grandfather, was finally born, he was frail and sickly. The labor had been long and traumatic, further breaking Amestris's physical strength. The infant lived for only 10 days. The official cause of death was recorded as natural causes, common enough in the ancient world, but the whispers in the corridors of Susa told a darker story. Some claimed the child died of neglect because the mother was too broken to care for it. Others whispered that in a moment of supreme madness and mercy, she had ended the child's life to save it from the world of Artabanus. Regardless of truth, the death of the baby shattered whatever fragile restraint Artabanus had left. He blamed Amestris entirely, accusing her of sabotage, and his treatment of her descended into sadistic cruelty. The accounts of physical abuse that followed are difficult to read. Servants reported hearing the sounds of violence from behind closed doors, and Amestris was seen with visible injuries, bruises that the heavy makeup of the court could not hide. She was often bedridden, not from illness, but from the severity of the beatings. It was a campaign of terror designed to break her will completely. Eventually, word of this brutality reached the king. Xerxes, who had tried so hard to ignore the consequences of his drunken vow, could no longer pretend not to see the destruction of his daughter. He reportedly sent private rebukes to Artabanus, urging moderation. But here we see the true erosion of the king's power. Artabanus, emboldened by his position and knowing the king's psychological weakness, essentially ignored the commands. He knew Xerxes would not risk a public scandal by forcefully reclaiming his daughter. The general held the moral high ground of the law, perverse as it was. The girl was his wife, and under Persian custom, she was his property. Xerxes was paralyzed by the very system he ruled, proving that even the King of Kings was a slave to the rigid structures of his empire. The story takes a violent turn in 465 BC, 14 years after the marriage began. The political tension that had been simmering in the court exploded when Artabanus launched a coup d'etat. In a twist of dark irony, the general used the king's moral failings as justification. He conspired with the eunuch Amestris and assassinated Xerxes in his own bedchamber. Some historical theories suggest that Artabanus manipulated the grief and anger of the royal family, perhaps even using Amestris' suffering as a rhetorical weapon to turn others against the king, painting Xerxes as a tyrant who sacrificed his own blood. The man who had tortured the daughter killed the father. For 7 months, Artabanus was a de facto ruler of Persia, acting as regent. During this chaos, one might hope that Amestris found liberation, but she was merely a pawn in a new game. It was only when Artaxerxes I, the son of Xerxes and Amestris' half-brother, rose up and crushed a rebellion, killing Artabanus in a desperate hand-to-hand fight, that the physical imprisonment ended. Artabanus was dead, his faction purged, his body fed to the scavenger birds. But for Amestris, the concept of freedom had lost all meaning. She was now 28 years old, but descriptions from the court suggest she looked like an old woman. Her hair had turned prematurely gray, her frame was skeletal, and her eyes held a vacancy that unnerved those who looked at her. Artaxerxes, trying to do right by his sister, restored her titles, gave her a palace of her own, and surrounded her with luxury. He tried to reintegrate her into the royal life, inviting her to feasts and ceremonies. But the damage to her psyche was total and irreversible. She refused to participate in the life of court. She retreated into a darkened wing of the palace, rejecting visitors' music and comfort. There is a heartbreaking anecdote that when musicians played a specific melody from her childhood, she flew into a rage, smashing the instruments, triggered by the memory of a time before her life was stolen. She lived on for another 8 years, a ghost haunting the halls of the living. She died at the age of 36, likely from complications related to self-starvation and severe, untreated depression. The official Achaemenid inscriptions, the grand carvings that list the triumphs of kings and the dimensions of palaces, do not mention her. She was erased from the record, an inconvenient blemish on the glory of the dynasty. Her story survives only in the margins of history, in the gossiping texts of Greek writers and the crumbled tablets of administrative records. But it is a story that demands to be remembered because it exposes the terrifying cost of absolute power. It reminds us that the victims of history's great men were often the women standing right beside them. Amestris was not destroyed by a foreign army or plague. She was destroyed by a father's vanity and a husband's ambition. Her life serves as a grim testament to the fact that in the game of empires, the most dangerous place to be is often the daughter of the king. As we look back at the ruins of Persepolis and the legacy of Xerxes, we must also look for the shadows of those he sacrificed. If this deep dive into the hidden tragedies of the ancient world has captured your imagination and you want to uncover more lost stories from the archives of history, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are countless other voices waiting to be heard from the dust of the past. If you have listened to the full tragedy of the lost princess, type Amestris in the comments below, so I know you are one of the few who bears witness to her memory.